Great. So now it's my pleasure to introduce to you. I'm just pulling up my notes here. We have Dr. Roxanne Jones Booth. And it's really my delight to introduce you as our keynote speaker today. Dr. Roxanne Jones Booth is the co-pastor at Riverview Missionary Baptist Church in Coeymans, New York. Dr. Booth is a three-time graduate of Howard University in Washington, D.C., where as an undergraduate, she received the Bachelor of Arts degree in Political Science and the Master of Arts degree in Religious Studies, and the Master of Divinity degree from Howard University School of Divinity. She's also a graduate of Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary in Hamilton, Massachusetts, having received the Doctor of Ministry degree specializing in missions and cross-cultural studies. After 7 years of marriage, Reverend Dr. Roxanne Jones Booth joined her husband, the Reverend Antonio Booth, in accepting a call to do missions work with the National Baptist Convention USA Incorporated Foreign Mission Board, and they moved to the Kingdom of Eswatini, formerly Swaziland, in May of 2006. And before their marriage, Dr. Booth served 4 years as a mission worker in the Kingdom of Eswatini and 3 years in Durban, South Africa with the Foreign Mission Board. So she's an adjunct professor at State University of New York in Albany, lecturing on African American religion in the Department of Africana Studies. She's also a member of the Capital Region's Poor People's Campaign Coordinating Committee and Political Education Working Group. And she is also the author of her first book in 2015 entitled African American Baptists and Mission, a Historical Guide. This book highlights the mission and ministry of the National Baptist Convention, Incorporated Foreign Mission Board, and her book is available for purchase at Amazon.com, Barnes & Nobles, and in ebook versions on Kindle and Nook. So there's much more I could say about Dr. Booth. She brings to us just a wealth of lifetime experience and perspective, and we're just thrilled to have her be our speaker today. You have to unmute yourself, Dr. Booth. There you go.
All right. Thank you, Peter, for that introduction. I'll pay you later. To Peter Cook, Executive Director of New York State Council of Churches, and to all of you this morning at this 2022 Ecumenical Interfaith Advocacy Day. I greet you all in the wonderful name of my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. I also bring you greetings from the Riverview Missionary Baptist Church in Coeymans, New York, where I serve alongside my husband, the Reverend Antonio Booth, as co-pastor, and Reverend Reginald Graham, our associate pastor. In addition, I'd like to thank you, Reverend Cook, for the invitation to address this wonderful occasion. As I pondered over the thought of addressing theological and anti-racism reflections on the advocacy work of the New York State Council of Churches, I was led to a book that I have taught from in my Baptist circle. The book is entitled To Serve This Present Age, Social Justice Ministries in the Black Church by Daniela L. Ayers and Reginald W. Williams Jr. This book is the textbook for the course, The African American Church and Social Justice, which I teach in my denomination's Christian Leadership School, which is a training component of the Sunday School Publishing Board of the National Baptist Convention, USA Incorporated. I'm a member of the National Baptist Convention, USA Incorporated, which is a historical Black denomination organized in 1895. In the book, To Serve This Present Age, it says that its first purpose, and I quote, is to be faithful to the call of God in Christ on the church. It states, if we are the church of Christ, then it only makes sense that God's people emulate the mission and ministry of Christ. That is, the church ought to be about justice because Jesus is about justice. When Jesus preached his first sermon, he quoted Isaiah 61, declaring that the Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. The first purpose of the book, To Serve This Present Age, is what I would like to rest my theological reflections upon. I contend that from Genesis to Revelation, the Bible addresses social justice as a requirement of faithful service to God. Micah 6:8 states, what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Except for the time of the reign of David and Solomon, the people of God were a conquered people, dominated by superpower nations during the biblical period. The Bible shows God's people living under oppression of 6 empires: Egyptian, Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, Greek, and Roman. Under these empires, the people were not free to determine their own way of being. They lived to survive. Jesus was born into a world ruled by the Romans. He understood the oppression of God's people and declared that he had come to let the oppressed go free. It was that freedom that my ancestors recognized as their freedom. This man called Jesus came to his own oppressed people and declared that there is a better way. In that declaration Jesus made that day in the synagogue, taken from Isaiah 61, he ended by saying, "Today the scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." In other words, Jesus said that this word had been made flesh. Poverty, incarceration, healthcare, and societal oppression were issues that were in Jesus's mission statement. Jesus's mission was to seek and to fight for justice for God's people, and in fact, all people. In May to June, into June 2018, I was asked to attend a meeting of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, held at the Union Missionary Baptist Church in Albany, New York. The pastor is Reverend Victor Covington. The gathering of clergy and church leaders was called to announce the re-emergence of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s Poor People's Campaign that Dr. King started in 1968, just months before his assassination. We were told at the gathering that through the efforts of Reverend Dr. William Barber and Reverend Dr. Liz Theo Harris, Dr. King's Poor People's Campaign was being resurrected. And for 40 days in the month of May and into June, in 40 states across the nation, people would engage in direct action protests against 5 interlocking evils: poverty, racism, ecological devastation, militarism, and the distorted moral narrative. As I sat and listened to the call to action against these evils, I was moved, touched, and inspired to join the struggle. For me, it was what Jesus would do. My first day of the protest, I served as a marshal, and then on I was a marshal for the 6 weeks. That day I wore a yellow band around my arm to identify me as a marshal. My responsibilities included keeping the protesters moving along the protest route to the state capitol building in the city of Albany. Over 2,000 people from Buffalo to Long Island showed up for the first day of the 40 days of direct action protests in Albany. Each week for 6 weeks, more and more people joined the protest for human rights. That first day of protest, as we marched down the streets of Albany with our placards and banners and singing songs of liberation and empowerment, I overheard a man standing on the sidewalk with another man and woman making comments about the protesters as we were standing in the middle of the street, blocking traffic at the intersections of Washington Avenue and State Street. The crowd of protesters stopped to write in chalk on the pavement at the intersection. We wrote, "Somebody's hurting our people, and we won't be silent anymore." The man who had come out of one of the office buildings at the intersection and who I heard complaining about the protesters he said things like, "These people who say they are poor should be at their jobs making a salary instead of blocking the streets." He also said the protesters were preventing other people who are poor from going to their jobs to make money to feed their families. What this man did not see was that the protest was drawing attention to the laws and policies that create challenges to affordable health care, low-wage earners, the homeless, and yes, even the environment. We were marching to the New York State Capitol to tell lawmakers that we demanded equality without partiality and changes to public policies and public priorities that cause oppression, inequity, and disenfranchisement. My faith compelled me to be present at the protests because injustices were being exposed and light was being shined on the problem with the systems and the policies that govern our society. I stand in solidarity with all the others in the Poor People's Campaign because it is what Jesus would do. On the occasion when Jesus walked into the synagogue and opened the scroll and read from Isaiah 61, he announced not only his mission on earth, but also the mission of all people who would follow him. For me, my participation in the Poor People's Campaign is what I am called to do. As Dr. King said over 50 years ago while imprisoned in a Birmingham jail, he said, "Moreover, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by and not be concerned about what happens in Albany. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. The liberating narrative coming from my faith tradition is that we do not sit idly by when unjust laws and oppressive systems confront us. My faith tradition has always been vocal and demonstrative, willing to lay down our lives on the line for justice, believing that God is on our side. God is on the side of the oppressed. As co-pastor of a church in a rural, upstate New York community, and connected to a larger body of Baptist churches in the Capital District area, I am determined to assist in fostering consistent awareness of the injustices in our community, town, county, and state, which affect all people. My participation in the Poor People's Campaign has shaken awake what has been in me all my life. I was raised in a Christian home by my mother, Amelia Marjorie Taylor Jones, and my father, Samuel Jones. Their parents, my grandparents, migrated from southern states to upstate New York to escape injustice of Jim Crow South, lynching, and the Ku Klux Klan. My parents raised me and my brothers and sisters to stand up for our God-given rights and persevere believing in the power of Almighty God. I recognize that I follow the legacy of activism that was first in my grandparents, then in my parents, and which is now in me. I will continue to be an unsettling force for justice because it is what I have been called to be. So intertwined with my theological reflection are anti-racial reflections. I felt that the best way to convey these thoughts was to share with you what I entitled A Letter to My White Friends, a letter that I wrote following the George Floyd murder and protests of 2020. This letter was published in my local newspaper and other media outlets. In my letter to my white friends, I shared these thoughts. I wake up every morning in skin that has been described alongside my abilities to be inferior by misguided scientists of the 18th century. Thanks to Karl von Linnaeus in the 1700s, we can know the place of each kind of plant and animal we find on Earth. He delineated the characteristics that make each life form fall into each group. His system was based totally on observations of an organism's physical looks. It was a truly impressive and valuable achievement. In her book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, Dr. Joy DeGruy says the problem with Linnaeus's findings was he went too far. He explained his systems to try to account for different types of humans, and unlike all his previous work, he classified humans using considerably fewer objective descriptors. With highly suspect effort to classify humans, Linnaeus began the science of anthropology and laid the foundation for 19th century beliefs about race that resulted in racism. The Gru further states that in his work, Systema Natura, he sets forth his race classification system using color as a criterion for classifying races, while also assigning moral and intellectual capacities to each race. These concepts became a permanent part of 19th century anthropological thought and language. Since the time my ancestors were forcibly brought to the Americas, and before the colonizers formed territories and then states, Africans were not human in the eyes of the people who savagely chained them and carried them in the belly of ships across the Atlantic. African people who were taken from Africa at no request of their own were merely property. We call that chattel slavery. Just like owning a cow, a chicken, or even a 5-pound bag of sugar, my ancestors were considered inhuman and subhuman. In 1776, I wrote in my letter, the Declaration of Independence was not written with my ancestors in mind. African people were not included in the celebrated language of the unanimous declaration of the 13 colonies of America. African people who had been in the colonies since 1619 were not the subject of the words that proclaim, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." White colonizers who capitalized on the need for free labor nearly 100 years before the Declaration of Independence deemed the African person as property. The colonizers were conditioned to thinking that people who did not look like them were not people at all. The colonizers attempted to enslave Native Americans. However, this plan of action failed. Beginning in 1837, under President Andrew Jackson's administration, Native Americans were forcibly removed from their ancestral homelands, marched across the Mississippi River, and relocated to reservation camps designed to keep them away from the people that did not look like them. The United States of America was founded on a principle that it has failed to live up to. I go on in my letter to say the Constitution of the United States, ratified in 1788, further designated the enslaved African as less than human through the provisions that allowed Southern states to count enslaved Africans as 3/5 person for purposes of apportionment in Congress. When my white friends ask me why the rage, I take the time to let them know that as a person of African descent, I understand how the United States has thought about me and Black and brown people for nearly 500 years. My rage is built into the fabric of the United States. My rage is that white America wants to disregard and in fact dismiss my history behind statements like, "Things have changed. We elected a Black president," or "I had nothing to do with slavery." I would like to say to my white friends that statements that attempt to placate me to think that things have changed only substantiate the fact that you do not hear what I'm saying or cannot or will not accept that my story is legitimate. When Amy Cooper, who was simply asked to put her dog on a leash, went to that awful place in her heart and called 911, telling an African-American man that she was going to tell the police that an African-American man was threatening her, she exposed implicit racism. having gone to that place inside herself where she believed that being a white person, claiming she was being threatened by an African-American man, can cause an immediate remedy that would leave her innocent of any wrongdoing, is blatant racism. She claimed later, "I'm not racist." She missed that her actions demonstrated her racism. What she did was to act out of a conditioning that made it possible for her to think that she could tell a lie on a Black man and the police would believe her. She weaponized her whiteness and had no idea what she did. This is an example of how racism is embedded in behavior. Weaponizing whiteness is an ugly way of being, and it has to be exposed in order for justice to prevail. To my white friends, go ahead and approach me with your concerns about racial tensions, because you know that I will tell you exactly what I feel, what I think and believe. We can and we do agree to listen to one another and not dismiss each other's experiences, because we value one another. And many of you, my white friends, believe that we all were created in God's image. We have common ground. I would like us to always recognize that we all bring to the discussion of race relations our baggage conditioned by our life's experiences. Not all of the things we have been conditioned to think about people of African descent or white people is true. But what is real for African American people is that our history in the United States of America has been tumultuous for centuries. This will not change overnight. It will not be something that we will see change in a day. But we have to keep working at it. And remember, we are all still work in progress. As I come to the end of my letter, I said, I am of the opinion that Maya Angelou has taught us, when we know better, we do better. I am aware that doing better is only the case for people who truly want the United States of America to be better. I believe the first step on this journey to doing better is to be willing to listen to the voices of the people who are telling their story. Listen with a heart to want to hear. It will hurt, but we can all heal together. The wounds of painful experiences of racist undertones in the memories of my life were ripped wide open after seeing and hearing George Floyd cry out, "I can't breathe." "I can't breathe" has been the cry of people of African descent in the Americas since our forced immigration. Metaphorically, listen when you hear someone say, "I can't breathe," because it is a cry of distress. Millions have died needlessly, and we don't need any more deaths due to the negligence and due to negligent showing, a negligent showing of humankind, and to negligence of showing dignity to humankind. My prayer is that, and I ended my letter to my white friends saying, my prayer is that all Americans will not allow the flame of the call for justice, equality, and equity to go out. It is an eternal flame that needs to be kindled and rekindled to burn throughout the generations. The preacher in me says, it's not over until God says it's over. And in the meantime, let justice roll on like a river and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. In regards to advocacy, I again turn to my involvement with the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. Reimagine, rethink, redefine have become buzzwords for the way forward since the horrendous summer of 2020, when we witnessed over 400,000 deaths from COVID-19, the murder of George Floyd, and protests across the entire United States against police brutality and systemic racism. Reimagine, rethink, redefine are words that challenge us all to adjust our way of thinking about possibilities so that they will not and cannot resemble what was. Because what was didn't work for us. What was didn't include us. What was is wrong. What was did not lift from the bottom so everybody rises. What was did not implement a living wage. What was did not address health care for all, enacting a universal single-payer national health program that puts people ahead of profit. What was did not expand our public health infrastructure to address social determinants of health. What was did not speak to or do anything for the 140 million people who are poor, low wealth, or one emergency away from economic ruin. And there is another word that can capture our thoughts and direct us away from what was and move us to the reality of what can and should be. And that word is reconstruction. The Poor People's Campaign today advocates that it is now time for the third reconstruction. The first reconstruction, following the Civil War, which pitted humankind against itself, sought a transformation of society from the bottom up. And in some areas, multiracial fusion coalitions of poor formerly enslaved workers and poor white workers, recognizing that their futures were tied to one another and that when the lift starts at the bottom, everybody rises. The second reconstruction again witnessed the strength of fusion organizing when Blacks and whites and everyone in between made major steps toward equality by strategically focusing the world's attention on unjust laws in the United States. This reconstruction brought about desegregation and voter rights. It's now time for a third reconstruction. Having learned the lessons from the history, our steps forward will unite the poor and dispossessed as a class to confront the ruling class and the injustice of poverty intertwined with injustices of systemic racism, the denial of health care, ecological devastation, militarism, and the distorted moral narrative of religious nationalism that seeks to blame the poor instead of addressing systems that cause poverty. This third reconstruction will be everybody in, nobody out. Reimagine, rethink, redefine, and let us reconstruct the more perfect union that was pledged in the Constitution of these United States so that we reestablish justice and domestic tranquility in the land of the free and the home of the brave. Thank you. Thank you for allowing me to share theological and anti-racial reflections on this day as you focus on advocacy. Thank you, Peter. Back to you.
Thank you, Dr. Booth, for doing exactly what we needed you to do today, which was to help us reflect on our faith and how we act in the public square to address great economic and racial disparities in our state and in our country, and really indeed around the world. So we're just so glad that you could speak to us, and also as a local pastor in a rural community, that is also very touching and powerful. I'd like to open it up here to questions from the audience. So let's see. Do I have somebody who would like to pose a question or make a comment? One of the things we really struggle with here is what we call environmental racism, where communities of color often are disproportionately affected by toxins in the ground, and bad air quality. You might be familiar with what's happening at Ezra Prentice, where they built a public housing development right next to a set of train tracks, and then have trucks spewing particulate all day, causing asthma and cancer. I was just curious if you, in your reflections, if you have some thoughts about environmental racism.
As you have just mentioned, those places here in the Albany, well, the Capital District area, are in places where majority of the population are people of color, mostly people of African descent. It's historically proven that individuals, or historically shown that those ecological devastating places in cities are where these individuals live. It's always a second thought about people of color, and it's been established over time. It's, as I said in my presentation, it's a conditioning that we have that we really need to look at as we move forward, because that is the way things have been done in the past. As we move forward, we've got to remember that we need to correct those injustices in more demonstrative ways. I hope that addressed that question in some way.
Indeed. Well, thank you. Our next question, now we've got some pouring into the chat here, so this is good. You said reestablish justice at the end of your presentation. Why reestablish when it was established? And this question comes to us from Vivian Ruth Waltz.
Okay, I took that word reestablish because in the Constitution, it does say establish justice. And we know that that hasn't been the case for people of color, people, Black and brown people in the Americas. So let's go back, now that we're in this time of re-examining, repurposing, and looking at things over again. Let's look at how we can establish that justice the way it should be established, and not excluding people, but including everybody. So that's why I use that term.
Okay, great. Thank you. Chris Mogensen, who is the chaplain at Broome County Jail, just reminds us about what we call not in my backyard, where we see that we sometimes place properties in places that people don't care about, or if we try to place property in places near homeowners, sometimes that's the most challenging thing. If people come out and they are screaming and yelling about, traffic or, too many school children or whatever, which is really coded racial language, or we don't want these kinds of people in our neighborhood. Any struggles with that you've seen in your own ministry?
We see that every day. And that's why I say, when we see what's going on, say something, let your voice be heard. It's not right, and we're not going to take it anymore. That's the lesson I get from the Poor People's Campaign. Somebody's hurting our people, and we won't be silent anymore. There is a groundswell in every Reconstruction, first, second, and now we're in the third. A groundswell of thought and momentum is there in the grassroots. And as we continue to speak out and not sit back and take what it is that we're seeing and walk past it and not speak out, things will change. There will be something done. But we have to continue to share and to speak our truth and continue to speak it, though others may not want to hear. And understand that it will happen.
Great. Our next question comes from Sister Catherine Darcy, who thanks you, Dr. Booth, for your presentation. Could you say more about the Poor People's Campaign? I understand that there will be a large gathering in DC in June, and indeed, I want to commend everybody on this call to attend it. However, what comes after that event in June? Will there be a network of advocacy established to change the laws both in Washington, DC and Albany?
Yes, that gathering will demonstrate to the powers that be that the people who are affected by the laws and policies created in Washington, that number of people, they're growing. Our voices are connecting, our paths are crossing, and we're understanding that we are all in this situation, Black, white, rich, poor, where the poor and dispossessed are gathering themselves together. And the more people advocating for justice will cause justice to flow like a mighty river. And so it's not do one thing and then it's over, but do that one thing so that you can galvanize and mobilize people, that we can continue to keep this flame going, because the struggle continues. It's an ever burning flame for justice, because evil exists. And there are going to be people who are going to try to tear down, put in hindrances, but we can't let that stop us. The history of my faith tells me keep going. I don't know how many of my ancestors did not survive, but I thank God there were some who did, and I'm here today to tell their story. And this struggle that we are in is a struggle that we all must take part in. We might not see what happens, but we know that we've been a part, or we've been on the right side, let me put that, of history. Mm-hmm.
Okay. We have some book suggestions in the chat, and including we should, if you, Dr. Booth, could put the names of some of the publications you referenced in your lecture in the chat, that would be great. This is a longer question from Bob Elmsdorf, Elmendorf, which really the essence of this stress is that we should be giving free college education to everyone instead of locking lots of people up in Dannemora and Attica. You talk a little bit about the relationship of higher education to incarceration.
And what's the question?
It's more just denoting a relationship. There's not really a question.
Okay.
What's the value of investing in higher education for people who are incarcerated?
Actually, it kind of was a question. If I could interrupt for a moment.
Go ahead, Bob.
I'm so sorry. I don't mean to be unquakerly about it. I was trying to think of this woman's name, but she was dean of professional studies at Harvard, and she wrote the book about giving every single person that was incarcerated a college degree. Okay. And it was the best book written that I had read on that. But my point is, as you just mentioned, Peter, shift it to below age 21. Everyone below the age of 21 should be getting an education, as Bernie Sanders says, at least at a public institution in this country for free. That's what I'm saying.
All right. Thank you. Much better phrase than what I tried to do.
No,
So
you did a
thanks,
good job.
Bob.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Dr. Booth.
Oh, I totally agree. I don't know how it's going to work, and I'm sure our previous speaker would elaborate more on that. And he did say, speak to that as far as educating. So I'm in totally agreement with what the caller has just said.
Okay, very good. Vivian, Ruth Waltz, I'll let you ask the next question here.
Actually, that wasn't my question. I responded to the question before it, asking Dr. Booth how to respond to people saying that the poor will always be with you and that jails will always be a reality.
Wow. I just read recently Reverend Dr. Liz Theo-Harris's comments on that same question, where people ask, and say, because the scriptures say the poor will always be with you. At times, we forget that we are reading in scripture the stories of people who understood what they needed to do in a theocracy. People were to leave behind their gleaning, their gardening, all of that. They were to leave behind something for the poor, because there were poor people that weren't able to do those things for themselves. So within that theocracy of the Hebrew people, they were commanded to do that, to leave things behind for the poor, take care of the widows and the orphans. It was a part of the structure of their nation, of their community, to take care of those who couldn't take care of themselves. So when Jesus mentions, when this woman who comes to him and anoints his feet with oil, and his disciples were upset that she could have spent that oil and used that money for something else, they were upset that she didn't use that money for the oil, that expensive oil, for the poor. Jesus said, the poor you'll always have with you, because he knew that the poor were supposed to be taken care of by the community. And that community includes the governing structures. So we're asking, do what you're supposed to do, government, lawmakers. Provide for those who are struggling, who are oppressed under systems that have been created and that are moving people from places of security to insecurity.
Great. Okay, so we have two more questions. One is from Sumati Divadet. And Sumati, could you pose a question?
Yes, I would like your observation on this observation of mine. I often use the term canaries in the coal mine to refer to poor people, to refer to who are both white and Black, to refer to the attack on diversity in our society and the rights of all of us to participate in this democracy. I refer to them as canaries in the coal mine because I think that those of us who haven't been touched by the machinations of those people with wealth and power in our society fail to recognize that we are also the targets. We're safe for now, but we're not going to be forever. There is a concerted effort in this society to really undermine the rights of all people in the society. And that they're going to go after, it doesn't matter what class you belong to, they're going to go after that. I read this provocative observation by a man called Peter Thiel, who was one of the founders of PayPal. And he is now one of these extreme right activists who commented, according to the New York Times article yesterday, that freedom is not compatible with democracy. Freedom is not compatible with democracy. So you see where these very rich, he's a billionaire, very rich are going, they want to, anybody who has any rights, they're going to attack. And that includes all of us who enjoy a little bit more comfort. This is a very serious problem. And I think the Poor People's Campaign is trying to mobilize this kind of movement and awareness in defense of a truly genuine democracy in this country. But my fear is that a lot of middle class and particularly middle class white people just are not, they keep the term poor, I think in some ways distracts people from the real issue at hand.
Yeah, I agree with you. The term poor, if you're not thinking that you're poor, you might be poor in spirit. You might be poor in other ways. Yeah, that can trip people up and cause folks not to really see the larger picture. When you mentioned the canary in the coal mine, if I could jump up and get a book, I would get it. But I recall that story about the canary in the coal mine being used to determine if there was some gases escaping in the coal mine that would kill the workers. So they'd use a canary, and if the canary was going down, that means get out because there's some gases that would kill everybody. And the writer uses that analogy in terms of understanding that if the poor in society are going down, if they're being unable to survive and sustain themselves, that's the indication that everybody is in trouble. So where we look at the poor and dispossessed, what is happening with them and with us? And it will determine the direction in which this nation is really going.
Yeah. Yes, thank you.
So we have time for one more question, and I'll just take it in priority order here. this question comes to us from Chibuzi Okori, who is in charge of reentry programs for the Church of Gethsemane. Elder Okori, would you be willing to just ask your question? Okay. Well, oh, there you go.
Go ahead. Go ahead. I wrote it down. Yeah.
No, go ahead, Chibuzi. Ask the question.
I'm so sorry, I was muted. I was asking about what can we do as a community, and we are struggling with this issue, the issue of racism in our community. We are not coming out to say more about it. What more can we do as a church to spread the news and come out in full-fledged to speak about racism, because a lot of people have been hurted, a lot of people have been discriminated, a lot of people have been damaged because of racism. So what can we do as a community to get this around?
As like the poor, who will we will have with us. These ideas of inferiority will be a part of us if we don't recognize why we do what we do. Somehow, yeah, I did mention in this presentation, this message about the idea of races, that they exist because of a human construct that was not designed to really speak to how people are different. It was just something that an individual looked at the physical features of different people and classified them, gave them moral and intellectual descriptions as well. So to understand that when we talk about race, it's something that we created, humankind created, but we're all human. We're all human. And beginning at that point, maybe we can make a difference in establishing ways to remove these hurtful and ways of thinking about others. I know in the community where I am the pastor, my husband and I are co-pastors, we call ourselves a multicultural congregation. We recognize the ethnicities of everybody in the congregation. We celebrate this month African American History Month or Black History Month. Next month will be Women's History Month. In the month of September, we celebrate Latino Heritage Month. In October, Italian Heritage Month. So we acknowledge all ethnicities and give everyone the opportunity to share their history and their stories so that we can all become more aware of who we are as a people. I like to think of harmony when I think of Riverview Missionary Baptist Church. When you have harmony, you have a sound that is beautiful, melodious at that. But you only get harmony when you have every voice, every soprano singing their soprano line, every alto singing their alto line, the tenor and the bass, all different voices, but coming together to create a melodious sound called harmony. And when we recognize that in our churches, in our communities, in the state, and in the world, we will move towards what I call a more perfect union. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Booth, for spending all this time with us and for your really deep and wonderful reflections. And we want to bless you in your ministry. We're so pleased your congregation is a part of the Empire Baptist Missionary Convention of New York, which is one of our partner denominations of the New York State Council of Churches. And we look forward to continued partnership in ministry with you.
Thank you again for the invitation.
Okay, very good.